you'd rather go way above and beyond on a client project than do a little bit of sales and marketing work, if you're more interested in crunching numbers than shaking hands, if you think networking should be about routers rather than cocktails with strangers, but somehow you ended up with sales and marketing responsibilities, this podcast is for you. Hi, Chief Nerd Ruben Swartz here, and I spent a long time learning these lessons the hard way. I want to help you learn them the easy way by sharing my experiences and talking with brilliant people who have figured out how to hack not just the code, but the sales and marketing process as well. Of course, as a nerdy person, I had to create a software application to help service-oriented people get more clients. So if you'd like to get more leads and turn more of them into clients and break out of the feast or famine cycle, check out Mimiran.com. That's MIMIRAN.com. You can find the application and also sample lead magnet and contract templates to help you grow your business. Now let's get to it. Today, I'm super excited to have Vanessa Van Edwards with me. She is the lead investigator at the Science of People, a human behavior research lab. She's also the best-selling author of Captivate, The Science of Succeeding with People, which is the book I read. And I immediately reached out to Vanessa and said, can you come on my podcast? This is super useful. In a perhaps larger endorsement, it was also chosen as one of Apple's most anticipated books of the year. She's been featured on CNN, NPR, Fast Company, et cetera, et cetera. Vanessa, welcome to Sales for Nerds.
Thanks so much for having me.
And Vanessa has a wonderful excuse or a terrible problem. She's not allowed to drink because she's got a young baby. Congratulations on little Sienna.
Thank you. And I do have a wonderful cup of coffee. I don't know if that counts.
Well, as long as it works for you, it works for me. In your honor, I've got some Argyle Willamette Valley Pinot Noir from 2013, which is really nice. I'm trying to appreciate Oregon wines a little bit more. I like the French stuff and I like the California stuff, and Oregon's kind of in between. It should be perfect, but sometimes I find myself just having trouble finding the taste that I really like, but this is pretty yummy.
It's funny. We're members at Argyle. It's like my favorite winery here. Their sparkling champagne, something to try.
We must just be on the right quantum wavelength or something.
I love it. Yes, exactly. Ringing endorsement for Argyle, and they're not a sponsor, I don't believe.
We'll have to change that. Anyway, one of the things that fascinated me about Vanessa's book was it wasn't one of these, hey, I'm so awesome with people and you can be too if you're just magically an awesome people person. It was, I was really awkward. And so I tried to take a scientific approach to figuring out how social interactions worked. And I was reading this, I was like, why didn't I think of that?
Yeah, what's funny is when I was growing up, I would always read books by very charismatic people, real people. And they would give advice that was very well-meaning and well-intentioned. But because they had never had to overcome extreme awkwardness, a little bit of social anxiety, not being natural, I found that their tips weren't working for me because they were already so far ahead.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. And so I wanted to figure out, was there a way that I could break down people skills for non-people people? I like to joke, I'm a recovering awkward person. So my book is dedicated to all the awkward people out there. And that's when I sit down to write a post, or even as we're filming this or recording this, I think to myself, okay, what can I do to break it down for someone who feels like they don't have it naturally?
Right. And that's kind of the whole point of Sales for Nerds, and probably why your book resonated with me. And one thing that I thought was really important that I actually want to bring up at the beginning, it's kind of at the end of your book, but you're talking about how sort of your emotions are really much more powerful than your thoughts. And you say how emotional systems tend to monopolize brain resources. It's much easier for an emotion to control a thought than for a thought to control an emotion. And I think that really struck a chord with me because it's like once you get in that fight or flight mode of social anxiety, it's very hard to remember all the tips and tricks and what you're supposed to do and just act naturally and so on and so forth.
Yeah. And that's also one of the reasons why one of the early tips I give, and I try to remind myself and my readers of this all the time, is that not all practice is created equal. So let's say that you have a new conversation starter or a new people tactic or even a new sales tactic. The worst place to try that for the first time is with your most important client.
Right.
And it's a little counterintuitive, right? We think, I have this new tactic, I'm going to try it out. And we bring it out the big guns in our next meeting. But the problem is we're already on higher anxiety. We already have our cortisol pumping. It matters so much. That's actually the worst place to practice it. So I like a kind of system that I think about is, could you rank your practice areas? Right? Everything from even texting with a friend, like trying a conversation starter there. Emails, that's another lower pressure practice because it gives you time to think about your responses. Phone calls, because you're not worrying about face-to-face. Breaking down the people in your life where you have easy clients and hard clients, right? We all have those split up for us. is there a way to systematically break down your practice so that you're ranking it in terms of emotional difficulty and you're only practicing the new stuff where your emotions are hopefully already going strong?
That makes a lot of sense. And it brings me back actually to college. One of the few things that I did right was I did a lot of job interviews with companies that I didn't really think I wanted to work for, just because I thought, well, I should probably just get good at interviewing.
Yes.
And then when I wanted to interview with the people I really cared about, I could really focus on talking to the person. And I would be there in the room in my flannel shirt, and there'd be all these people in suits who were literally sweating because, suddenly they were starting to interview and it was really important to them. And I could at least relax a little bit because this stuff takes a lot of practice.
Oh, I love it. So, it's funny. In our very first lesson of People School, I have all of our students try to join a local meetup that's not in their industry. It's super great practice. And if it's in their industry, they might meet people that they know, or they might, it really matters more. So I'm like, okay, join a meetup about goldfish, join a meetup about Twilight the book, right? Like join a meetup that doesn't matter, that's sort of silly, even about a passion or a hobby, because that's such a great breeding ground to be able to practice everything you learn in all the curriculum.
Right. It makes a lot of sense. And I think we have that fight or flight response in our brain for a reason, but we're not about to get eaten by a lion. And one of the things that I realized is if I go to a networking thing and somebody doesn't want to talk to me, like it really just doesn't matter that much, right? It used to kind of freak me out. Oh, what if this person doesn't like me? And as you talk about, then you were worried about what if happens if I start making offensive jokes because I'm feeling awkward, and it just spirals downhill. And finally, I think I just got comfortable enough in my own skin that I was like, I'm just here to meet people and have an interesting conversation. And that may develop into something else, but I'm not trying to close a deal right here when I'm talking to somebody. Right? I'm putting too much expectation on this short interaction. Let me just have a pleasant short interaction. And lo and behold, networking went from something that I completely dreaded and hated and sucked at to, I wouldn't necessarily say I'm good at it, but I'm like, oh, this will be fun. I'm going to go meet interesting people and have interesting conversations.
Yeah. If your only goal is to have a pleasant interaction, that's a really low bar, and that's a good thing, right? Like just pleasant. You don't have to be the most memorable person in the room. You don't have to close a deal, just pleasant. That bar is hittable, right? It feels like it's achievable, and I think it takes out a lot of the pressure.
Right. And then you can go and act naturally. I think one of the things that you also said was very interesting is sort of that triple threat position where you have friendly posture, you make eye contact, and you don't have your hands in your pocket. Hands in your pocket are for murderers. And I'm like, when I read that, I was like, gosh, I wonder how many rooms I've shuffled around with my hands in my pocket looking like a murderer.
Yes. Okay. So let me break this down a little bit, because I think that the biggest response I always get whenever I teach this in front of audiences is I say, please don't put your hands in your pockets. It's for murderers. And try to not cross your arms. And someone always raises their hand and they say, but that's what's comfortable for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I really do encourage people to be comfortable. Like I never want them to do something that's inauthentic or out of their own skin. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. The reason why it's comfortable to go into blocking behavior, that kind of body language is called blocking, is because it protects our vital organs.
Mm-hmm.
Hands in your pockets, a little bit closer to your vital organs. If your hands are across your chest, it's protecting your heart and your stomach, your abdomen. And so from a physiological perspective, of course it's more comfortable, right? Of course our body's like, phew, I have a block up, literally, physically, from anything that's a threat.
Right.
The only way that we can trick our mind into realizing that we're not going to have a physical threat, right? At a networking event, we're most likely not going to be physically harmed, is remembering that all we're trying to do is make an emotional connection. And there's no possibility for physical threats. And so trying to shift the comfort from a physiological sensation to an emotional one, I think helps us take our hands out of our pockets, those murderers.
That's a great point. And something that I've been working on a bunch is, if I go meet my friends, I'm excited, I'm happy, I have like my hands are visible, I'm giving hugs, getting hugs, whatever. I'm excited. If I go meet strangers or it's a quote unquote work setting, it's a whole different thing. My hands might have been in my pocket. I'm just not excited.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized, obviously there's a difference between seeing a great friend and seeing somebody who is a prospect or a vendor or something like that. I'm not saying they were equivalent, but it's like, what if I just treat them like a cool person that I want to spend time with, right? Even if it's a 30-minute phone call to discuss something work related. It doesn't have to be that we're about to go have the world's greatest adventure, but like just be open to them as if they're a friend. And suddenly I think you were talking about like my whole physiology changes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then it's easier to have a real conversation.
Well, that's actually a mental trick that I play with myself, which is how would I greet a friend I haven't seen in many years? Because it's almost impossible to greet a stranger like a friend. Like that's not real. But if let's pretend that you were seeing someone across the room and they were like a very old friend you haven't seen in a long time, there's a sort of warmth there. There's still an unfamiliarity, right? You haven't seen them in a long time, but there's a little bit of warmth there and a little bit of excitement. Like, my gosh, I haven't seen you, Greg, in so long, or whatever, I think that if you can play a little trick on yourself where if you catch eyes with someone across the room, that happens, you're in a big networking event or whatever, Rotary Club or party, and you catch someone's eyes across the room and you're like, do I approach or not? Pretend that you just made recognition with them. And that recognition actually translates to warmth, engagement, and invitation. And that usually is a really nice way to actually walk across the room and say, hey, good to meet you. My name's Vanessa. It really translates well as a sort of easy warmth instead of just, a cold approach kind of thing at a networking event.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think that's what I'm trying to do. And what I had been doing for a long time is something that you describe in the book. It's like your worst gremlins come true, right? If you're afraid and you're awkward and then you're worried about being awkward and you get more awkward and more worried and so on.
Yeah.
It all goes downhill quickly. But if you can just relax and say, hey, this is somebody like a long lost friend or whatever, and just have a normal human interaction, it's a lot easier. Something that you talk about that I also thought was really interesting in the book is, okay, so now you're walking up to someone and you're about to talk to them. Instead of starting a conversation, you use the term sparking a conversation. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. Yeah. So there's a couple of interesting things when we talk about the art and science of conversation. And for me, this was a big one when learning people skills. And it wasn't just new people. It was also chit chat. It was rapport with, friends I was sort of familiar with that I see over and over again. There's those people in your life where you just see them over and over. It could be extended family, could be colleagues on a different floor, could be you're in the same industry circles. And it was really challenging for me to try to spark any kind of interest, right? Every time I saw them, it was the same. It was so scripted. It was like, hey, so how's it going? Good. How's the work situation? Great. How's the wife? Yeah. All right. Well, good seeing you for the third time this year. Nice. See you in 3 months. Like that was what it was like every time. I was like, I'm brain dead. They're brain dead. I know this person is interesting, right? This person has to have friends. This person has to have a story. And I do, another topic is I do believe that everyone is interesting. I don't think there's any boring people. I'm like, so why are these conversations so boring? And so I realized that what you're actually having to look for is some kind of a spark. It doesn't matter that you are keeping those social scripts in that comfort zone. What's much better is to spark any kind of aha or nonverbal surprise. And so I began to devise a series of conversation sparkers that actually solicited some kind of awake response. So that we both weren't brain dead as we were talking.
So what would be an example of that?
So what I like to do is I like to think of words that solicit excitement. And the brain is really interesting in this way. I won't get into my favorite research on priming, but when we talk about certain kinds of words, the brain actually tries to search for examples of that word. So for example, if I were to say, hey, how are you? It's a brain dead question, right? There's almost no emotional meaning in that question. So we answer brain dead and say, good, fine, okay, right? Maybe on a bad day we say, oh, it's been busy, right? What I'd rather do is try to engage the brain to look for something that sparks something good. So I would say, working on anything exciting recently, thing good happened today, that forces the other person's brain, A, out of a social script, but B, to then begin to search the day for anything good or to search their life for anything exciting. And almost always, I would say 90% of the time, and I will talk about the 10%, 90% of the time, someone's like, oh, actually, and they tell me something that I never would have expected, something good that happened in their day, an exciting side hustle, exciting side project, an exciting big project, something. The other 10%, because there is 10% of the time where they can't think of anything. And if they can't think of anything, I always end up in an also incredibly deep conversation. Because what happens in that 10% is you say, so working on anything exciting recently? I kind of go, I don't know. And I'm like, you know what? I've been there. Sometimes it's just like, you're in that rut, right? Like you get up and there's just nothing happening. They're like, yeah, I don't know why that's happening. I guess it's because I've been, and they begin to go into a little bit of a deeper explanation into why that might be happening. And I end up having both incredible conversations with the 90% and the 10%. So those are my two kind of go-tos that I would start with. They're the entry level questions. I'm happy to give more advanced ones. Those are the ones that are a little bit more entry level.
Those are great. And one of the ones that I tend to use is, so how do you know so-and-so, right? If we're an event that's organized by so-and-so, which was also one of the highly rated ones in your book.
Mm-hmm, exactly, because that's a mutual contact. And that also is a spark.
And that also is helpful for me because I spent a long time ignoring like, oh, do you know so-and-so and blah, blah, blah. And like they would list off a whole bunch of names that, maybe I would know some or know the connection. And I would just like, my face would just glaze over and I would just ignore it all mentally. And then I would wonder why I can't remember anyone's name. And so it's kind of also to help make sure that I understand how the human fabric is woven together when I meet people.
Yeah. So can I tell you something funny? I actually have never taught this before, but now that you're mentioning this, there's something that I do whenever you say, so like I went to Emory University, for example. So occasionally someone will say, oh, I have a friend from Emory. Do you know blank, right? That always happens, like your university or, living in a small town or a company you used to work for. I would say once a week, someone asked me, do you know blank? And I used to, when they said, do you know blank? And of course, inevitably, I never did. So I would always say, I would say, oh, no. And it was like, oh, right. It was like this really awkward,
right?
You don't know them. And then what happens? So what I do now is when someone says, oh, do you know blank? And I don't know them, I say, no, but are they great? And it's so funny because every time I do that, the person laughs and they go, yeah, they are pretty great. And they usually tell me a little bit about that person and it kind of transitions us off. Because usually when someone does that, they're like getting ready to tell you about that person. But if you don't know them, it doesn't matter. But still, even if you ask, oh, are they great? They'll usually tell you something like, oh, yeah, I thought you knew them. They were, president of their fraternity and they were wild in college. Oh, how funny. Whatever, right? It's an easy way to avoid an awkward point if you say, oh, are they great?
Well, and then you also get to know that person a little bit better because you kind of hear how they're connected and what stories they have. And it's funny, you mentioned the Emory thing. I wasn't going to bring this up till the end, but I really like your little bit about when you were dialing for dollars for Emory.
Oh, yeah. So I used to hide this part of my history actually, because I thought it was like shameful that I was a telemarketer. At Emory, there's a kind of Emory telefund, and I would call alumni and ask for money, and I always sort of felt ashamed that I did that. I didn't talk about it for a long time, and then finally I was talking to my editor, and I was telling her this story, and she's like, "Why is that not in your book?" And I was like, I don't know. Does it make it sound terrible that I was a telemarketer and I called people during dinner specifically? And she's like, no, you have to tell a story. And so that was an incredible experience. And by the way, I think everyone should at least do 6 months in some kind of sales position. Everyone, because it is the most incredible way to develop your interpersonal skills. And on this, when I was working there, I would get hung up on all the time. I mean, I had abysmal rates. And there you had like a kind of chart on the wall of who were the best people raising the most money. And I was always the lowest. It was horrible. And I realized that that's because I called people with one goal, which was raise money. And that was actually the wrong goal. A better goal was I want to get them to tell me stories, because I realized if I could engage an alumni, even if they didn't give me money, about reminiscing about Emory, about telling about their time. Either way, I gave them a good phone call and a good memory of their school. So maybe next year they would donate, but very often that also led to a donation. And so that was my entire goal, is how can I get an alumni to tell me a story? And then that was when my numbers shot up. I ended up staying there for the entire 4 years I was at Emory because it was such a great job. And I loved it after that. And that was a huge turning point for me interpersonally as well.
And it's about, the person's, your supervisor was asking you, do you love Emory, right? And you said, of course. And then all the calls started focusing on that as opposed to someone's checkbook. And it's something that took me a long time to notice in sales. It's almost like this jujitsu thing. The more you're focused on getting a dollar, the harder it is to get a dollar. Mm-hmm. And the more you're focused on what that other person cares about, first of all, the more of an authentic human interaction you have, which I think is invaluable in a non-monetary sense. But then that's also going to help the people who might want to give you dollars much more quickly than if you had just come straight after their checkbook.
Yeah, and that brings us back kind of in a nice circle, which when we talked about earlier about going to a networking event and just your only goal is to have a pleasant interaction. I think in any kind of sales call, the goal is never to close the deal. Not really. The goal is something else. You just have to figure out what that something else is. Is it a pleasant interaction? Is it learning about them? Is it building a relationship with them? Is it getting to the next level with them? I talk a lot about levels of intimacy in my work. And so I think that that's a much easier place to focus. It's much less intimidating, as we talked about, but it also makes you more human. Just the indirect side effect is that you become more authentic.
Right. And they can kind of decide, is this someone I might want to give money to? Because we like to buy things, right? We don't like to be sold.
Yeah.
But giving them the space, and you even talk about empowering people to sort of have control over their destiny financially and emotionally and so on, that feels really good. If you feel like you're being backed into a corner by an aggressive salesperson, your natural response is to go into that blocking posture, right? Even if it's only verbally.
Yeah.
And to protect yourself.
Yeah, and we block both emotionally and physically. In fact, when we have crossed arms, we tend to speak in shorter sentences and say no more often. So another kind of sales tactic that I use when I'm with clients is from a nonverbal perspective. If I see someone go into blocking behavior, putting their hands in their pocket, crossing their arms, I will do everything and anything I can to just get them out of that nonverbal. Forget the sale. I know that I'm so much less likely to get any kind of openness from them when they're in that body language. So I will ask sparking conversation starters. I'll go back into rapport building, or I have props that I use. Like I have a bunch of pamphlets and flyers about my speaking. Usually I'm trying to close deals around speaking engagements or like bulk course sales. Flyers, pamphlets. I don't actually need those props, and I save them for the moments of the meeting where I want them to unblock. So when I see them go into that blocking behavior, I'll pull out a flyer and say, here, why don't you take a look at some of our online courses you could buy? Just so they can have something to sit up, reach forward, and then look at the sheet of paper. So I also recommend, if you can have props you don't give at the beginning of your meeting. Don't ever give your props away right at the beginning, because then the first 5 minutes of your meeting are them looking for the props.
Right.
Always save the props for when you see the blocking behavior.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Now, something else that really resonated with me, it was like, oh, if only I had this book, however many years ago I needed to have this book. I've actually gotten a lot better at it before I read the book, but you put it so well. It's like highlighting and praising other people is great. You don't have to impress other people. Let them impress you. Mm-hmm. And I've always been one of those people, or at least I grew up as one of those people who's like, whatever it was never enough. It wasn't quite perfect. And someone could compliment me on doing a good job, but I dismissed it because it wasn't perfect. And I wasn't impressed with anyone else because they weren't perfect either.
Yeah.
And at some point I noticed, gosh, I really like the people who are a lot more positive. They're a lot more fun to be around than the people who are always negative. And I think I'm one of those negative people. What if I could just like be happy for myself and be happy for other people? And right, it's okay. No one's cured cancer yet. Even the people trying hard, like let's all just help each other be positive. And so this notion of let's highlight what other people are doing instead of trying to brag about ourselves, I think is a really powerful technique. Not just for sales efficiency, but just for human connection.
Yeah. And I think that remember when you're with someone, it's of course our instinct and our intuition to put our best foot forward. And that can really slowly over time, especially in networking or business environments, change or morph into trying to impress people. Right? I don't think that we often go into networking events thinking I'm going to be impressive, but that desire to put our best foot forward can sometimes pervert its way into being impressive. And when you're trying to impress people, you're actually missing a huge opportunity, which is giving them the pedestal. So sometimes what I try to do when I'm with someone or I'm in a group of people that I really want to make an impact, right? Like I really want to make an impact. I actually don't think about what I'm going to say or what I'm going to share or stories I'm going to tell. I think about if I was about to introduce this person to speak on a stage, and I had to get to know them really quickly to make a really impressive introduction. What do I have to know about them to make that impressive introduction? That drives a very interesting set of questions because you then are searching for accolades, right? You're searching for things that they have about them that are really impressive or incredible, and that allows them to impress you. And I find that that is actually far more impactful than you trying to show up and list all of your accolades, if that kind of backward way makes sense.
I think it makes a lot of sense. And I think it takes a lot of pressure off, and it helps, especially introverted folks, reach out and make that connection with people. And just, I think for me, part of it was like, let me be kind enough to myself to understand that nothing's ever going to be perfect.
Yeah.
Right. And so once you get over that, then you can be happy with whatever's going on, right? Progress is good. Perfection is impossible, but progress is good. So if people say something nice about me, I try to just say thank you instead of dismissing it. And I'm also noticing that I'm much more, oh, that's so interesting. That's so cool. How'd you do that? Et cetera. And a lot of times people, because they're so deep into it, they may take it for granted as well. Like, well, of course I can run a bunch of Ironmans. I do it every year or whatever, right? Which for me, I think is just a crazy cool achievement. And everything you're saying, I wish I had had this book decades ago.
Oh, I'm so grateful. I mean, I think I wish I had had the book too, in a weird way. When I was talking to my publisher, Penguin Random House, in the very, very early stage of the book, and they say, what kind of book do you want to write? I mean, this was really early. And I was like, I want to write the book that I wish someone had handed to me when I graduated from high school. As in, like, you've been learning technical skills for the last 18 years, English, math, and history. Here are all the people skills that you didn't get to learn in addition to your academic ones. And so I'm so grateful that you feel that way, because was my entire goal when I was writing it.
Well, and separately offline, I might have to ping you for advice. In my last a couple podcast episodes ago, I got challenged by an author who said, well, where's your book? Uh-huh. And I hemmed and hawed, and of course I'd had a glass of wine. So and then I actually ran into I was at an event yesterday. This is all tied together in a weird way. I was at an event last night for Scott Ingram, who just released a book of sales success stories. And he was on my podcast a while ago. And, I didn't realize that he was up to date with my podcast. He's like, where's your book? I know you're committed to it. I heard that episode. And I was like, oh no, there's nowhere to hide.
Yeah, well, maybe you have to write the sales book that you wish you had gotten at the beginning of your career.
That's right. It's the Sales for Nerds, the book. But that's
I can't wait.
That's a whole other conversation. So there are some other really interesting things going on in your book. And so one of the things that struck me as a super nerdy person is, like, you have diagrams of, like, where to stand and where not to stand when you're at a networking event.
Yeah.
And so we can't show the diagrams. This is a podcast, obviously, but just talk a little bit about kind of what people should and shouldn't do. Because I realized I had done all the stuff I shouldn't do when I started attending these things. Again, like, wish I'd had that book a long time ago.
Yeah, me too. It's really common. Well, one of the biggest questions when I was doing research for the book was around events and parties and networking events. People asked usually 3 different questions, which was, what do I say? Where do I stand? And what do I do at these events? And, I really delve into kind of what do you do and what do you say, but I hadn't really thought about where do you stand. And so because we're a lab, we do lots of different kinds of crazy street experiments. And so we ended up doing a giant speed networking experiment where we observed people's body language in the room and then tracked their contacts, their LinkedIn network connections, and then the actual conversations they had. And
so cool.
There was a lot of interesting learning that I talk about in the book, but I think the biggest one is you always want to go for the sweet spot in a room. And I split a room up. Every room kind of has the same thing, a start zone, an end zone, and a social zone. And the social zone, the best place you can stand is right where people exit the bar. And
that's where I'm usually standing.
Yeah.
That part I got right just accidentally.
Exactly. Like, we're talking about wine, like, that's because there's something psychologically that happens to someone once they've gotten their drink. And even if it's just water, even if it's just coffee or tea, usually up until then, you're going to have really short, kind of stunted interactions. But when someone has gotten their drink, they're kind of like turned to face the room. That's your sweet spot, because they're like, okay, I'm set. I got something in my hand. Now what? If you are right there to talk to them, you become that what? So you become that sort of, yep, right here to talk to you. And it's so easy to open conversations, because you can also say, so, how's the red wine? Or, so good you're here. How do you know the host? Or what brings you here tonight? It's a really, really great area right for conversation. It's one of the best places to stand, in my opinion.
I think you mentioned in the book, like, that way you save them from having to drink alone.
Yeah.
And they also, like, people will also come back to get their glass refilled.
And I joke, be a social savior. Like, go rescue people who have just gotten their drink and have no one to talk to. Like, then you become one of the most impactful people in the room, because you're saving someone from social anxiety.
I think that was one of the interesting realizations that I had at some point. It was like, wait, nobody here knows anybody, or 80% of the people don't know each other. It's not just me.
Yeah.
Right? I used to walk in and feel like everybody knows everybody except me.
Nope.
And that's not the case.
Yeah, if not worse, right? They might be even less confident than you.
Right. This Argyle is really good. We'll have to do some kind of follow up at some point when you can participate fully in the whole Sales for Nerds experience.
I know. I believe me, I'm counting down the days till I can start having wine again.
Oh man, I still remember the first time we went out after we had our twins. Of course, my wife did all the real hard work, and we went downtown, and she didn't bring her ID because she didn't think, why would she need an ID? And we were out of practice, and we actually got turned away from the first bar we went to because she didn't have her ID. I was like, well, that's a pretty flattering thing at this point. I think we should just put that in the win column and move to the next place.
That's a win. I think that's a total win.
So something else that you talk about is the need for stories.
Yeah.
And you have this great technical analogy of the story stack, and you talk about, your software stack that you use to host your website and all that, which I really appreciated as a nerdy person. But
nice.
Let's talk about the story stack.
Yeah. So basically, I think that we've all been told that stories are good. We've all been told the more you can share stories in your elevator pitch or your presentations or your sales pitches, the better. But when we actually break it down, it's very hard to elicit stories from our own life. And I get really tactical with it. I literally have a note in my phone. It's called my story note. And I break it down to a little story toolbox where I think about a topic that comes up regularly in conversation, and then a story that has to go along with it. So, for example, one of the examples I give in the book is interesting names comes up pretty regularly, right? You meet someone, they're like, oh, my name, I just met someone yesterday, my name is Amari. It's like, oh, what a beautiful name. Where does that come from? That's a great, easy question, right? You can ask them, interesting, beautiful name. Where does it come from? And then there's sort of this lull, right, after they explain their story. So I have a couple of stories of other interesting names. One of them is, when I was younger, I went to school with a set of twins, a male and a female. And because their parents had mixed up the lines in the birth certificate, they were called Male and Famale. And they just added accents to their names because their names were actually male and female. It always gets a laugh. It always gets a chuckle. And then usually people have their own kind of crazy, interesting name stories. So it's thinking about not just the stories in your life, but also how stories can be tied to topics that come up regularly so that you can actually have an easy segue into telling them.
And so how long should these stories be? I think one of the things that's hard for people is there are some folks you can tell they're really shy and they don't really share. They're kind of rushing through the story. And there are other people who talk for 10 minutes without considering whether the audience is interested or whether anyone else wants to talk. What kind of story is the right length?
So the story I just told was a 20-second story, right? Like it was very, very short. I can also make that story much longer if I want to. My general rule of thumb is you should be getting some kind of aha moment, laugh, every 30 seconds, if not the story is too long.
Okay.
So if you are telling a story and it's gone more than 30 seconds without any kind of, oh, wow, really? Aha, haha, anything like that, it's too long. You got to shorten it, you got to add a joke. So that's typically my rule of thumb. Like if you're making people laugh every 30 seconds for 15 minutes, that's fine. People will normally sit and listen quite happily. But if you're talking for 10 minutes without any kind of engagement or spark, it's too long for people.
Got it. Okay. Something else you mentioned that I think is really interesting and underutilized, certainly by me, is the value of just asking people for advice.
Yeah. So this is called the Franklin effect. And it's one of the final chapters in the book because I think it's a really powerful topic, which is when we ask for favors, people actually begin to like us more. And I think it's because we end up putting them in a position of help. And we always like to help people. And asking for advice is one of the best ways you can ask for a favor because it's knowledge help as opposed to physical help. Like I wouldn't recommend going around asking everyone to help you move. That's not, it's not going to win you any friends. But if you ask for advice, it's a really nice way to ask for a favor. And so almost always before a networking event or even like a dinner party or like a coffee meeting, I usually will think about what's one piece of advice I could ask from this person, a genuine one, not just asking for advice for the sake of asking for advice, but what's something that I really would like to know from them or know about them that could help me in some way. And that's also a really great way to go in as a goal. If your one goal is to get a good piece of advice from them, that's also a pretty great way to go into interaction because you're not trying to close a deal or close a sale. You're just trying to make them the expert.
Right. And I think a lot of times we think either I don't want to trouble somebody else or I don't want to admit that I don't know something, right? That was a problem that I had to get over myself.
right? Like I'm supposed to just know a lot about stuff. And, as you cite in a slightly different context at the beginning of the book, we don't expect the athlete to play every position.
Right.
You can know some things about whatever you're supposed to know about, but not have to know everything about everything. And so I think being able to ask for that advice is a great way to connect. It's a great way to just learn things, which is, after all, kind of like the whole point of your book and my podcast is people have struggled with this stuff and done things the hard way. Let's take advantage of them as much as possible and learn our own things the hard way, right? Don't have to do things the hard way that people have already done.
Right. Exactly. I totally agree.
Well, some of your book keeps bringing me back to, I don't know if you've ever read Howard's End by E.M. Forster. That would be super cool if you did.
I've never read it. I wish I have.
So it's one of those great books of literature that I read and did not get anything out of other than only connect. So somebody listening is like totally offended right now that I'm such a heathen. But that's the whole message of the story. And really what I took away from your book was how to actually do that in a way that feels comfortable and authentic and isn't going to cause a bunch of fight or flight response.
And I wish I'd read the book because it sounds like exactly something that I like to teach.
Well, wonderful. And Vanessa, I know you've got to go attend to your infant daughter. Thanks so much for carving out the time. I know it's not easy. I really appreciate it.
Oh gosh, thanks for having me and thanks for giving me a great conversation.
All right, Vanessa, talk to you soon.
All right, talk to you later.
Bye.
Bye.
Have a friend who'd benefit from this episode? Pass the word along. Have a friend who wouldn't benefit from this episode, but you haven't talked to in a while? Give them a call. Of course, iTunes reviews are great for getting the word out and also for helping me make the show that you want. So if you've got topics or guests that you want discussed on the podcast or in the apparently upcoming Sales for Nerds book, let me know. And if you want to automate client acquisition, turning more web visitors into leads into conversations, and onto closed deals, while helping you stay in touch with the people who matter, check out Mimiran.com. That's www.mimiran.com. And once again, thanks for listening.